What's up, everybody? My name is Matthew, and today we are going to be talking about recovery. So, specifically about recovery, that I want to cover today is the topic of metabolism. Now, metabolism is incredibly important for us to understand because it helps us optimize recovery. Now, it is my mission to help everybody improve their health literacy so that they can make sound decisions for their medical care and medical treatment in the future. So, without further ado, let's dive deep into this video. So, metabolism is a pretty broad topic, but the things that we're going to be talking about today specifically is going to be about energy balance. We're going to talk about macronutrients and their role in our body. Next, we're going to be talking about some myths that I've dealt with in the past and deal with constantly when I talk to people about nutrition and metabolism. And last but not least, we're going to tie it all together and see how does it apply to your own life in a very practical manner. Metabolism. So the first thing about metabolism to understand is energy balance. Now, energy balance is incredibly important because in our lives, we are either going to be in two camps. We are going to be either in the camp of a calorie deficit or we're going to be in a camp of a calorie surplus. Now, depending on how long you stay in each camp, that is going to define how heavy you are going to be. Now, if you are going to stay in a calorie surplus, you are going to put on weight. If you're going to stay in a calorie deficit, you are going to lose weight. Now, it's incredibly important to understand the distinction between the two, but it is not important to understand the exact number. So the exact number is generally for the people who are more interested in fitness, who are more interested in optimizing their performance. But for the general population, I would highly recommend you just understand the overarching principle of being in a calorie deficit and being in a calorie surplus. Now, how do you know if you're in a calorie surplus or a calorie deficit? Well, it helps if you understand how heavy you are. Let's say, for example, you are a 60 kilo person. If you're a 60 kilo person, if you stay in a camp of a calorie deficit for a long period of time, you're going to drop below 60 kg. And if you are in a calorie surplus for a prolonged period of time, you are going to hop above 60 kg. So, in general, that is a very objective way to figure out if you're in a calorie surplus or a calorie deficit. But let's talk in realistic manners, in realistic terms over here. Generally, people don't eat the same thing every day. And so because people don't eat the same thing every day, they could yo-yo in terms of being in either a surplus or a deficit. But if you stay in a calorie deficit, right, within this camp for a prolonged period of time, you might suffer a few symptoms. And I caution you to pay attention to this in your own life. So are you very easily irritable? Are you always suffering from brain fog? And do you have problems with your complexion or even your sexual health for men and female? So if you said yes to any of this, perhaps you might be living in a camp of a calorie deficit for a prolonged period of time. So I suggest you try to eat a little bit more if that's the case, and try to replace your diet with a lot of whole foods and fresh foods. That might help, foods that are very nutrient dense. Now, a lot of people understand this concept of being in a calorie deficit and being in a calorie surplus. If you lose weight, if you want to lose weight, you need to be in a calorie deficit. But the composition of your body, and what I mean by composition is your muscle mass and your body fat. So in terms of optics, so when you look at somebody and you perceive them to be quote unquote healthy, generally they will have a pretty high number of skeletal muscle mass, and also they'll have a pretty low number of body fat. So if you look at a person and you think that they are unhealthy, in general, they would have a little bit more body fat than they do skeletal muscle mass. So when we are trying to lose weight, we are really trying to be specific about it. And when we try to be specific about it, I suggest you pay attention to how much body fat you're losing. And so, yes, you're going to lose weight, objectively speaking, if you stay in a camp of a calorie deficit, eating whatever it is that you want. It could be a nutrient dense foods, or it could be highly processed foods. If you stay in the camp of a calorie deficit, you are going to lose weight. But that composition that your body is going to be in after you lose weight will really matter. So as your body tends to recomposite, your body is trying to either retain muscle or it's either going to lose muscle. Now, if you have a diet filled with rich foods that are calorie dense and have enough adequate protein, you are definitely going to retain as much muscle mass as possible and predominantly lose fat. So you need to, of course, train hard if you're into fitness. But if you just want to preserve muscle mass, I highly suggest you pay attention to having whole foods. Okay. Next is understanding macronutrients. So macronutrients is incredibly important for us to understand at least the basics of it. Now, we don't need to understand how is it exactly metabolized in our body, but we need to understand the functions of why we take it in our diet. So dietary protein is a protein that we need because we need to repair ourselves. So if we want to repair our muscles from breakdown, we need to give ourselves adequate protein to repair and rebuild. That is incredibly important. So the next is carbohydrates. So carbohydrates is incredibly important because we want to make sure that we are having enough carbohydrates because it is stored in our bodies. So carbohydrates is stored in our bodies in a few places, in all of our skeletal muscle mass, and also in our liver. And so that is important to understand because if we do not give ourselves enough carbohydrates, we're not going to store it in a form of glycogen in our liver or in our muscles. And then if we have very little glycogen storage, we're not going to have a lot of energy to call upon when we need it. Last but not least, we need to think about our brain. Our brain is very important because we need it to function in this world. This is a very complex world that we live in, and our brain goes through a lot of processes throughout the day, and it uses carbohydrates. If we do not give our brain sufficient carbohydrates, we're not going to be able to think clearly. And the last macronutrient I'd like to talk about is fats. Now, you don't need too much fats, but you definitely do need fats. Fat is essential. And the reason being is essential is because it aids in hormone production. Now, it's incredibly important that we have dietary fat because we need it to create testosterone, we need it to create estrogen, progesterone, all of the hormones that we produce, sexual hormones in general. Those are important because those come from dietary fat. If we do not give ourselves dietary fat, our hormone production is going to be compromised. That is fact. So I've worked with a lot of people in the past, and the more people I work with, I feel that there is a common theme when it comes to trying to lose weight. So when people try to lose weight, if they're in a calorie deficit, yes, you're going to lose weight. And where they choose to starve themselves is carbohydrates. And because we are trying to understand the functions of all the three macronutrients, as I was mentioning before with carbohydrates is very important for us for energy. Now, in general, we're not going to have a lot of energy being in a calorie deficit, but we want to optimize how awful we feel. And carbohydrates is the key to that. We need carbohydrates to fuel our workouts. We need carbohydrates for our brain. We also need a certain level of carbohydrates to spare muscle protein. And so breakdown. And so if we want to maintain as much muscle as possible, it really behooves us to take that minimal amount of carbohydrates necessary. So pay attention to that if you're looking to lose weight. What that might look like in terms of a practical world, generally bland foods have less fat in it, and foods with a lot of sugar and a lot of fat in it is going to be more calorie dense. So it's actually better to, when you're on a diet, to have more bland food than to have more yummy food and less of it, because the food and less of it is still more calorie dense, but not neutrally dense. If you have bland food in general, it's not be very nutriently dense, but not very calorie dense because it doesn't have a lot of fat inside it. So that's All of this is very important to understand in the realm of recovery because at the end of the day, we need to restore ourselves. And in order to restore ourselves, what we put in our bodies is incredibly important. And so what we put in our bodies is very important in terms of the types of food that we eat, the types of minerals that we take into our body. That's going to affect our composition, is going to affect our health in general, and also objectively when it comes to how much calories we need. So when we want to restore ourselves, we need energy. It takes energy to restore ourselves. And if we are not eating significant amounts of energy in our diets, we are not going to be able to restore ourselves optimally. So I caution you to try to pay attention to your diet, to pay attention to the diet overall, and the understanding the overarching principles of energy balance, which is being a calorie deficit or a calorie surplus, understanding a little bit about macronutrients, understanding that they are all important, not proteins, carbs, and fats being the most important of one or the other. How much of it will vary from your goals in life. And also try to always maintain a healthy balance between a diet. So what I mean by that is that you always want to make sure that you don't live life in extremes. You don't want to crash diet and then crash diet again to be healthy, and then crash diet to eat whatever you want, and then crash diet to eat healthy. This yo-yoing it's not sustainable. And it's also very harmful to your body. Your body is going to respond in a very inflamed way. So you always want to try to reduce as much inflammation as possible. In order to do that, we need to have our food, we need to fill our filled with nutrient-dense foods in order to minimize body inflammation in our joints and our gut. If you manage to do that, we'll manage to recover optimally and we'll manage to be the best versions of ourselves. So the reason why we make this video is to help you improve your health literacy, to also make sure that you become the best versions of yourself, to be the best version of other people, of yourself to other people in your lives. Be kind to one another, be good to one another. I'll see you in the next one.